Hello, everybody. Welcome to the very last lecture of the semester. Um, Hard to believe, or maybe not so much. Maybe you are ready to be done. Nevertheless, this is chapter 18, Nutrition During the Adult Years, mostly focused on elderly. So for your learning outcomes, you're going to have to be thinking about the factors that affect the rate of aging. So what makes some people seem like they're older than maybe they are. We'll also have to describe the physical and physiological changes that occur during adulthood that will affect nutrition needs. Identify the factors that put elderly at higher risk for malnutrition. Know the current nutrition recommendations for elderly adults. Describe the community nutrition services for older persons and identify any nutrition related health issues of the adult years and describe the prevention and treatment of these health problems. So here is a slide from the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. This is not from your textbook, but I always like to show it just to think about what's happening in the population and what age groups we're sort of seeing. So this is the percentage of the population over the age of 60. That's the blue line. And you can see that has been increasing, kind of lulled. And then we have a huge increase, and now we're kind of projected to stable off here towards the middle of this century. The percentage of the population that's over 65, similar increases. The percentage of the population over 85, so we kind of think of our oldest citizens, is also slowly increasing and projected to increase as well. So what this is meant to be telling us is that our population is getting older. People are living longer. More and more people are living really long. That is a testament to our health care and how that's improved, and we're better at detecting and treating diseases. But that also means that people might have greater healthcare needs as they live longer, and we need to be able to help people the best we can, especially if you're in the healthcare field. So when we think about what age is considered elderly, the answer is, we don't really know. There's no single chronological timetable of human aging. You really have to think about someone's health and physiology. It's more important than the number of years that they are old. We certainly know the second bullet point that genetics, lifestyle, and disease processes affect the rate of aging. That was one of your objectives. And just kind of understanding that, you can have someone who's 50 years old and seems elderly, what you might think of as elderly, and you could have someone who's, 75 years old and seems quite young. So what is the difference between those two examples? Certainly genetics, which you don't have control over, but it's certainly a predictor of someone's disease likelihood. Lifestyle, which you do have control over, and we'll be talking about today, especially the nutrition and physical activity components of lifestyle. And of course, whether or not you have certain diseases, which is a combination of genetics and lifestyle. So those three things are really important. We, of course, think mostly about nutritional risk and nutritional risk factors for diseases. And those really depend on a variety of factors. So, a couple of important points. We do have separate nutrition recommendations for people aged 51 to 70, and also for those 70 years old and older. So, the adult lifespan is quite long, and we know that both physiologically, there's differences between a 50-year-old and an 80-year-old, even though they'd all be considered adults. And when there's difference physiologically, that also means that there might be differences in what we would recommend for the nutrition. And this is really mostly about those DRIs, the dietary reference intakes we talked about at the beginning of the semester when we talk about separate recommendations. And when you're thinking about, what you would recommend, say you're trying to determine how much saturated fat a 50-year-old should have. It's more than just the fact that they're 50 years old. We'd also have to think about their overall health, what their cholesterol levels are, what their risk of heart disease is, the quality of life. So lots of factors to consider when you're making specific nutrition recommendations. You've probably seen this in other health classes. It's looking at the leading causes of death in the United States. This is again from the Centers from Disease Control, not your textbook. It's going to um, show you that what everybody always says in health classes, that heart disease is the #1 killer in the United States. And it's showing you about how many people die from heart disease every year. Cancer is close behind. And then the other causes of death are not nearly as significant, I guess, as heart disease and cancer. Some of these are not always directly interpretable. Like I give you an example of diabetes, which looks like it's not very deadly at all, but the fact is they use the death certificates when they look at these. So sometimes they might not list diabetes, they might list a complication of diabetes, like renal failure or something like that. So some of these get a little bit diluted. There's parts of this lecture that start to feel a little depressing. Maybe not if you're a young person below age 30, but as you get over age 30 and you begin to realize that the body is going to decline to some extent no matter what you do, that's kind of what this slide is saying. So this is the average. Of course, it's not going to be true for everybody, but it's the average remaining capacity. It's really showing you the rate of decline in some of these different physiological functions of the human body. So if I always look at the extremes, right? So what's this kind of green color? It's actually smell sensitivity. So believe it or not, your ability to smell things declines with age. And it's actually a pretty significant decline, um, even in middle age, and to the point when you're 80, you really aren't likely to smell nearly as good as you could before the age of 30. And if you kind of think about all of these things that are declining and how that might impact both your health and your kind of normal daily activities, the speed of your nerve impulses, your basal metabolic rate, which drives how many calories you consume, the blood output from your heart, your breathing capacity, the way your kidneys work, your strength, your smell, and your bone mass. So those are all declining. Now, how quickly they do is going to depend on things like lifestyle factors, but part of the aging process. So a couple of more specific facts about that as we age, if you think about your cardiovascular health, around the age of 25 to 30, the average maximum attainable heart rate declines by about 1 beat per minute per year. So that's not a huge change, but if it's cumulative, so every year you add on another decline, by the time you're 80, that's a significant amount of decline. Your heart's peak capacity to pump blood drifts down by 5 to 10% per decade of life. And if you think about what that actually means, of course, you're not going to have to memorize or know these exact numbers, but if you think about your cardiovascular system not working as efficiently with aged, that means you have a diminished or lessened aerobic capacity. And that means that you are going to feel fatigued and more breathless with modest activity compared to when you were younger. You're going to get more tired more easily. Other things that happen as we age, even in middle age, our blood vessels begin to stiffen and blood pressure often creeps up. Blood becomes more viscous. So if you think about it getting like stickier, harder to move through your arteries and veins, it also becomes harder to pump through the body because of that. and the number of oxygen carrying red blood cells decline. So when you think about those changes in our cardiovascular system, that's why we have some of these nutrition recommendations. And when you think about the fact that cardiovascular disease does kill more Americans than any other disease every year, these are really important. We know that a low sodium diet, so keeping under that UL, does go a long way in keeping our blood pressure down. So that is what drives those recommendations. We also know that having a lot of potassium, similar to what we recommend for the DASH diet, is also good at preventing high blood pressure or hypertension. We know that omega-3s found in fish and fish oil supplements are good at helping thin our blood, and that's going to combat that higher blood viscosity I talked about right here. So all of these are evidence-based recommendations that we give to try and keep people healthy. Another chronic disease that impacts many older Americans is type 2 diabetes. We know that blood sugar levels rise by about 6 points per decade, making type 2 diabetes distressingly common in the elderly. And if we think about, how do we prevent that, the rise in type 2 diabetes is quite astonishing if you look at the data. The main risk factor for that is actually excess weight gain and inactivity. So if we're trying to make nutrition recommendations so people can maintain a healthy weight, and lifestyle recommendations where people are meeting the physical activity recommendations, we would see a lot less type 2 diabetes with aging. We'll talk a little bit about the skeletal system next. This is driven by hormone changes that happen during aging. So for men, testosterone, the main male sex hormone, declines by about 1% per year after the age of 40. This leads to a drop in both muscle mass and bone density. For women, bone loss occurs mainly after menopause, another great hormone change for women with a loss of estrogen. So the physiology is this decline in hormones. The outcome is an increased risk for things like osteoporosis, which is why we have different calcium and vitamin D recommendations for older adults. Um, for women, it's anywhere from 100 to 1200 milligrams of calcium per day. For men, we go up to 1200 milligrams after age 70. So older adults need more calcium to help preserve their bone mass. Remember, calcium is one of those major minerals. Now, the fat-soluble vitamin D, is needed to absorb that calcium. And so we have higher vitamin D requirements in aging as well. Another physiological change is a slowing of the digestive tract and decreased digestive secretions. So think about, enzymes and other things that help with digestion. Dietary changes, activity changes, and medication can also play causal role, meaning that they may cause digestive and absorption problems. So what do we recommend? We want fiber. The fiber recommendations aren't different for aging, but we do know they become increasingly important because you're so much more likely to have issues with constipation specifically. So 21 grams of fiber for women, 30 grams for men. Trying to meet those fiber recommendations through diet, because we also get a lot of nutrition that way. So a high fiber diet would have nuts, fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. We also know that getting enough fluids and exercising can also help with constipation. I'm going to talk next about risk for malnutrition. So technically, malnutrition means bad nutrition. And when we talk about elderly and bad nutrition, we're talking about undernutrition most of the time. So we know that when you don't have adequate nutrition, you're undernourished, that's going to give you the diagnosis of malnutrition. And that means that your health is going to be compromised. Your immune system won't work as well. You'll become more frail, and the decline that we see in physiology will happen more fast or quicker. And so we have to really be careful to prevent malnutrition in the elderly. So, why do we see it so much? There's a variety of reasons. This slide is talking about sensory changes. So, sight is an important one. If you can't see as well, think about what that would mean in terms of food preparation. You may be afraid to use the stove or even the microwave if you don't see well. It'd be more difficult to go food shopping, read nutrition labels, read menus. So, to preserve our vision, there actually are some important nutrition recommendations. We know for sure that carotenoids, so the plant forms of vitamin A foods, you see listed here lutein, xanthan, and beta carotene. Those are all different types of carotenoids. We know those help prevent our retinol from degenerating. So good to have those bright green and orange and yellow fruits and vegetables for eye health. Carotenoids and vitamin C and E also may prevent macular degeneration. Those are all good antioxidant that would be protecting your eyes from oxidative stress because they're taking in sunlight all day. And we know that vitamin C, that water soluble vitamin, can help prevent cataracts. A lot of the vitamins designed for elderly will have a lot of these nutrients in them because eye health is so important as we age. We already talked about the decline in smell, and when you don't smell as well, you often don't taste as well. We also know that not having enough zinc, that good mineral, um, can result in even worse smell and taste. So for the elderly, we don't have a specific nutrition recommendation. We just want to make sure that they're not becoming deficient in zinc. And we want to try a variety of new flavors, experience with different types of low sodium seasonings. And don't overcook the food, which is going to further decrease the flavor. This is important because if you don't smell well, you're not going to taste food as well. And sometimes our default is to add more salt and more sugar, which is not going to help with the hypertension and type 2 diabetes that we're worried about in our elderly population. This is also an important physiological change, sort of body structure changes, which is shown in the picture here. You see normal muscle mass and declining muscle mass. So if you think about muscle as lean mass, or parts of the body that are not fat are more protein in this case, we know that when you lose your lean mass, your resting metabolic rate also declines. So your metabolism is a big driver of how many calories you can consume. And if you're eating too many calories for your decreased or lower resting metabolic rate, you're going to gain weight, right? You're going to have excess energy, and that's going to be stored as body fat. And we know that body fat, that extra fat, contributes to a rise in LDL or bad cholesterol and a fall in HDL or the good cholesterol. So you want to maintain your muscle mass is the story at the end of the day. One of the ways you do that is by meeting your protein recommendation. So at least zero point 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. It might be even higher than that depending on your disease state. We know that being active, especially strength exercises, will help preserve your lean mass. And we know that following a heart healthy diet, so thinking about where your fats are coming from, is going to help make sure that your LDL cholesterol is in a good place. Loss of body water. So your lean mass holds on to water. So when you lose your lean mass, you also lose some of your body water. We know that about 72% of our total body water is in fact in our lean muscle. Other things that make dehydration a risk in elders is you can lose your sense of thirst as you get older. You also might be more forgetful and forget to drink. and you might be taking medications that cause frequent urination. So, dehydration is more common in an older person, and we recommend at least 5 to 8 cups of fluid a day in order to prevent dehydration. Dental health, oral hygiene. You can see the picture there. That man does not have any teeth. He doesn't look too upset about it, but that can compromise nutrition and put you at more risk for malnutrition. So if you've lost all your teeth and you think, oh, that must not happen anymore, but it does. Dentist care is usually very expensive. Not everybody can afford it. And sometimes your gums, if they get diseased, they don't aren't it's not comfortable to wear dentures or other things that you can do for your teeth. So this really is a problem for a lot of older people. And nutrition wise, we want to focus on nutrient dense foods. So, getting the most nutrition out of our foods and thinking about a way to do that that people can chew. We worry most about protein. Protein tends to be the hardest thing to chew. And so, helping people choose forms of protein that they can still chew, like ground meat, tofu, beans, eggs, tuna. You know, think about how hard it would be to eat a steak if you didn't have teeth, and what are some alternatives to more of those dense, chewy foods. Depression is another thing that puts someone at risk for malnutrition. Depression is more common in the elderly. You know, if you think about um, having more disease and not working anymore and maybe being a little disconnected socially, it can be a very difficult time of life. Other barriers to healthy eating include financial barriers, difficulty cooking for one. I hear that from a lot of older people. Not only is it depressing, but hard to do and hard to shop, and also limited resource for shopping and preparing food. Um, you know, getting to the store and um, things like that. So having adequate social support and possibly psychological interventions are important, not only for, again, mental health, but also preventing malnutrition. Talk a little bit about alcohol abuse. We talked about that kind of right around spring break time. We know that alcohol abuse isn't just a problem in the younger years. About a third of it begins later in life. You think about lifestyle changes, possibly more free time, loneliness, depression. Maybe you just have a social life that involves more alcohol as you get older. Physiologically, we already said this, but older adults have less body water to distribute alcohol and tend to metabolize alcohol slower. So that's a long way of saying they're going to feel the effects of alcohol faster. We also know that alcohol can deplete some of our B vitamins. So we do need to be thinking about alcohol abuse when we're thinking about someone's risk for malnutrition and sort of asking those questions to make sure that that alcohol abuse is not happening. Like for all adults, we recommend moderate drinking. And anyone over the age of 65, men or women, we recommend one drink a day and not more than that. Another thing we have to worry about is foodborne illness. Our immune system does tend to be weaker as we age. We also tend to have less stomach acid that helps normally control bacteria. So we do have to be careful about undercooked food, anything raw, rare. Um, is not often recommended. Undercooked and raw shellfish, you have to be careful about unpasteurized dairy products and fruit and vegetable juices. Raw milk and cheeses are not recommended. Sometimes, like even fresh apple cider from a farm stand might not be pasteurized. You have to be very careful. Eggs is a food we often recommend. It's a good source of protein and is generally easy to chew and affordable, but you do need to make sure that they are fully cooked, even the yolk, to prevent foodborne illness. And then other things to keep people safe: washing your hands, washing your counters, um, thawing the food properly, keeping it out of that sort of bacteria danger zone, and not using any expired products. Another risk factor for elderly are medication interactions. About a quarter of elderly adults take multiple prescription medications. And we know that those medications can have many, many different types of side effects. Different medications can affect appetite. They can make your appetite go both higher or lower, and can also interfere with the absorption of some nutrients. So you do have to be aware of the side effects. Sometimes it can also get complicated because some medications cannot be taken with certain foods, and certain foods can interfere with their action. So I put a picture at the bottom there of grapefruit. Grapefruit is a wonderful fruit. It's full of vitamin C, has a nice sort of tangy flavor, but grapefruit has something in it that interferes with a lot of medications, including some of the cholesterol-lowering ones that we often prescribe. So that's just one example of an interaction that you'd have to be careful about. So some specific nutrients and how their needs change depending on um, your physiology. Iron is a good example. Iron, we've talked so much about having a deficiency being bad, but we also know that too much iron is a pro-oxidant, which is not anything that an elderly person would want. So we have to be careful about iron, and we only supplement if there's a true iron deficiency anemia. We also know that after menopause, women do not need as much iron anymore, so their needs decrease to 8 milligrams a day. We'll talk more about B12, but B12 is a common deficiency in elderly because they don't absorb B12 as well. They don't have as much gastric or stomach acid that is helpful in getting the B12 out of food so your body can absorb it properly. Um, we know that a deficiency of B12 can cause pernicious anemia, nerve damage, and cognitive decline. So our recommendation for B12 doesn't change. It's 2 micrograms per day, which is the same no matter how old you are. But for elderly, we know that supplements or fortified foods for B12 are actually better absorbed than the B12 in food. When you take it in supplements or fortified food, the body doesn't have to extract it from the protein in food. That's why it's better absorbed. B6, another water-soluble vitamin, is increased with advancing age. We don't know exactly why we need more. We just know that we tend to have lower amounts, so there's a higher requirement. We know that deficiency can lead to irritability, depression, and confusion. And additional symptoms can include inflammation of the tongue and sores and ulcers on the mouth. We also know that if anyone's taking anti-Parkinson drugs, these can form a complex with vitamin B6 and make it look like someone has a deficiency. So you have to be aware of that if you were doing any blood tests. So again, B6 is one of those that we need more of as we get older. Calcium and D, we already mentioned this, but we're worried about osteoporosis and aging. We know that we don't absorb calcium as well in the intestines. We also know the kidneys are less able to retain calcium, so we have an increased urinary calcium loss. For vitamin D, we know that elderly are less likely to be outside in the sun and more likely to be using sunscreen. We know that there's a decrease in the capacity of the skin to synthesize vitamin D and a decrease in the capacity of the kidneys to convert vitamin D into the most active form. So these are the reasons why calcium and vitamin D are higher in aging. Here's an example of kind of a summary of nutrition recommendations. This is the My Plate. That's for all Americans to try and promote healthy eating. This has been adapted for the elderly. So some key messages is keeping physically active as we get older, and then thinking about, I had already pointed these out, but making sure there's enough fiber, having water and other beverages to prevent dehydration, using fortified foods or supplements, especially for vitamin D and B12, which are more common in deficiencies. Here's an example of some screening tools. So I gave you lots of reasons why elderly are at more risk for malnutrition. A screening tool is something that you can do fairly quickly. It's usually just a couple of questions. And when you add up the score, it's going to tell you if you should go see a doctor for further evaluation or a dietitian. So if you got a low score in this case, you were fine. You kind of got a medium score. You know, you might be at risk for malnutrition. If you got a high score, then you really are at high risk and you need a more complete assessment. So we'll talk a little bit now about exercise. We talk a lot about nutrition recommendations. Obvious obviously a difference between more couch potato and someone who's out and keeping their strength up and doing their exercise. I don't know who said this first. I had a professor who in class said if exercise were a pill, it would be the most prescribed medication in the world. And it's now been many years since I took that nutrition class. It was actually a nutrition class for elderly, so a whole semester long class based on some of these concepts we've been talking about today. And it always stuck with me. You know, if you think about how powerful exercise is and how helpful it is for maintaining health and preventing health problems, and there's no pill or medication that can even come close to the benefits. So whatever ways we can think of to help our aging population be more active um, would go a long way in preventing disease. So you've heard these before, I'll repeat them. We know that adults really need to have three types of exercise to have a complete sort of fitness routine. We know that endurance exercise, anything that's kind of considered cardiovascular, is important. It's going to make our cardiovascular system stronger, lower our blood pressure, protect against weight gain, improve our insulin sensitivity, and improve our cholesterol levels. So doing, you know, about 30 minutes a day most days of the week is really, really important. We know that resistance exercise, it's anything that's going to, you know, use your muscles and flexibility training are important, about 20 minutes, 2 to 3 times a week. And especially for elderly, exercises for balance can help avoid injuries and prevent falls. So, kind of summarizing the information we went over today, how to age well, the pictures focus more on cosmetic changes and maybe how to look good as we age. I'm really tackling this more on how to be healthy and avoid disease and hopefully enjoy your older years and not spend them going to the doctor all of the time. So in my list, I put exercise as number one. I think that really does go a long way. And probably right along with it is to eat properly for heart health and weight management. You know, if we can keep our blood pressure down and our cholesterol down and our weight down, um, we would really go a long way in preventing a lot of the chronic diseases that are so problematic. We also probably need supplemental calcium D and B12 as we get older, drink plenty of water, limit our alcohol. I didn't talk about this, but kind of the mental health aspect and how powerful that is, keeping our mind active and stimulating and building strong social networks. And of course, as always, getting regular medical care. So hopefully the more we do these things, the happier we will be as we get older. So thinking about the programs that are in place, because this is a vulnerable population, there's many programs out there that are designed to help our aging Americans. Congregate dining would be this picture. Um, think about people congregating, so getting together in order to eat and have that social experience, but also have a very low cost meal that provides some good nutrition. There's lots of congregate dining programs around. Most towns have them if they're big enough to have some type of senior center. This is a picture of a home delivered meal. Most people would recognize this as Meals on Wheels. Getting all kinds of emails about this. This is so important right now when people have to be at home. We can't have congregate dining when we have a infectious disease pandemic going on. And we need to make sure the people who deliver the meals to those vulnerable people are safe and healthy. So they're really desperate for volunteers, and in some cases, they're even paying people to deliver meals. If that's something that interests you, let me know. I have lots of contacts, people who work in this field. Another resource is food stamps. This is true for any American who meets the income criteria. This can be used to buy groceries at grocery stores. Specifically for seniors, we have a senior farmers market nutrition program. This allows low-income seniors to get coupons that can be used for farmers markets, roadside stands, and other community-supported agriculture program. So those are great programs because they really encourage healthy food, thinking about mostly fruits and vegetables that are grown locally. So good for the environment as well. We have a number of products targeted toward the elderly. You can buy multivitamins that are specifically for people over the age of 50. So some hallmarks of those, they typically will not have iron or no iron, just because it's not a common problem, and we know that too much iron can cause more oxidative stress on the body. They will have that extra D, B12, and B6 that we recommend for older adults. A lot of them will have lutein and lycopene, which are carotenoids that we know are good for eye health, and lycopene we know is good for some types of cancer. I've seen vitamins for memory. Just be warned that I give you an example of focus factor. These aren't as well proven. If you have someone you're worried about dementia and cognitive decline, you really need to see your doctor. Um, if you do see those, they usually have more omega-3, B12, and B6, and vitamin D. But again, not a whole lot of evidence that this is going to be effective in improving someone's memory. Another type of supplement are liquid supplements that you can drink. Often people will use these, especially if you're worried about malnutrition. If they're having trouble eating and they don't really feel like eating, you can get a lot of nutrition just from a drink. These will almost always have extra protein in them. They'll have some energy or some calories for that type of nutrition. They're usually going to be low in saturated fat, and some of them will even be low in sugar, and be mostly about, again, the protein, and they'll often have vitamins and minerals in them as well. Just going to end thinking about some, I think, interesting topics. If you know anything about centenarians, there's a lot of people who are interested in researching centenarians. Those are people who live to be 100 years old or older. I don't know if any of you remember the movie Karate Kid, but one of the characters was from Okinawa, Japan. And that is a real place in Japan that has more centenarians per capita than anywhere else in the world. So because of that, they've been pretty closely researched. If you think about how cool that is. So why do we think that they live so long? One of the things they've looked at is diet. And they know that the typical diet is filled with tofu, so that plant-based protein, whole grains, probably a lot in the form of rice, vegetables and fish, very little meat and dairy products. They are not overeaters. They practice something where they only eat till they're about 80% full. And they also have, I think, good mental health activities. They practice martial arts, and generally have a positive spiritual attitude and a low stress way of living. So if you want to live to be 100, you might want to think about some of these things for possibly your own lifestyle. And that is it. Thank you all so much for your participation this semester. I'm sorry it had to end on kind of a weird way, and I hope you all do well on the final exam, and I can see most of you in person in the fall.